The night was unusually quiet in Willow Creek, a small suburban neighborhood where nothing much ever happened. The streets were empty, save for the occasional flicker of a street lamp casting long shadows on the pavement. Officer Mark Reynolds sat in his patrol car, sipping lukewarm coffee from a thermos as he drove slowly through the area. His shift had been uneventful so far, just the hum of his engine and the distant sound of crickets filling the air. It was one of those nights that felt almost too calm, like the world itself was holding its breath. As Mark turned onto Maple Street, something caught his attention out of the corner of his eye. At first he thought it might be an animal darting across the road, but when he glanced at his rearview mirror he saw movement coming from the mouth of a narrow alleyway. He slowed the car and squinted into the darkness. There, illuminated faintly by the glow of his headlights, was a tiny figure running toward him. Mark's heart skipped a beat. It was a little girl, no older than 6 or 7, her blonde hair tangled and her pajamas torn and dirty. She was barefoot, her feet smudged with dirt and scratches, as though she'd been running for miles. Her face was streaked with tears, and she clutched something tightly to her chest, a stuffed teddy bear, old and worn with patches of fur missing and one button eye dangling precariously. "Hey, are you okay?" Mark called out, quickly parking his cruiser and stepping out into the cool night air. The girl didn't stop running until she reached him, throwing herself against his legs and sobbing uncontrollably. Her small hands gripped his uniform as if she were afraid he might disappear. Mark knelt down, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's all right, sweetheart. You're safe now. Can you tell me what's wrong?" For a moment, all she could do was cry, her tiny body trembling under the weight of whatever fear had brought her here. But then, between gasping breaths, she managed to choke out 3 words that sent a shiver down Mark's spine. "They're still inside." Her voice was soft but urgent, carrying a desperation that made his stomach twist. Before Mark could ask who they were or where inside was, his eyes fell on the teddy bear she held. Something about it seemed eerily familiar. The faded brown fur, the frayed ribbon tied loosely around its neck. It stirred a memory deep within him, one he couldn't quite place yet. A cold knot formed in his gut as he stared at the toy, wondering why it felt so significant. The girl sniffled, looking up at him with wide, tear-filled eyes. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We have to go back." Mark hesitated, his mind racing. What was this child doing out here alone in the middle of the night? Who, or what, was still inside? And why did that teddy bear feel like more than just a childhood keepsake? Whatever the answers were, they weren't going to come easily. But one thing was certain: this wasn't going to be another quiet night in Willow Creek. Mark's mind raced as he tried to piece together what was happening. The little girl stood before him, her tear-streaked face illuminated by the soft glow of the street lamp. She clutched her teddy bear tightly, as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. Her words, "They're still inside," echoed in his head, heavy with meaning he couldn't yet grasp. He knew he had to act quickly, but something about the situation felt off. "Okay, sweetheart," Mark said gently, forcing a calm tone into his voice. "Let's get you somewhere safe first, all right? Then we can figure out what's going on." He reached out and carefully guided her toward the open door of his patrol car. The girl hesitated for a moment, glancing back over her shoulder at the dark alleyway she'd emerged from. Whatever or whoever was back there clearly terrified her. Once she was settled in the passenger seat, Mark grabbed a blanket from the trunk and draped it around her shoulders. She pulled it close, wrapping herself in its warmth, but her eyes never left the teddy bear in her lap. It was then that Mark noticed how worn the toy truly was. Its once plush fur was matted and threadbare, one of its button eyes hung loosely by a single thread, and the faded red ribbon tied around its neck looked like it might unravel at any moment. Something about it tugged at his memory, nagging at the edges of his thoughts. "What's your name?" Mark asked, trying to distract her from whatever nightmare she'd been living through. "Lily," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the dashboard lights. "Well, Lily, I'm Officer Reynolds, but you can call me Mark." "Can," You tell me what happened? Who are they? Lily's lower lip quivered and fresh tears welled up in her eyes. She hugged the teddy bear closer, burying her face against its patched-up chest. For a long moment, she didn't say anything. Then, in a voice so quiet Mark had to lean in to hear her, she murmured, "My mommy and daddy." Mark's heart sank. He'd dealt with enough cases involving missing persons to know this wasn't good. But there was something else, something deeper, that made his stomach churn. Why was she alone? Where were her parents now? And why did she look like she hadn't slept or eaten in days? "Where are they, Lily?" Mark pressed gently, not wanting to overwhelm her. "Can you show me where they are?" She nodded slowly, pointing a trembling finger down the street toward a row of houses shrouded in darkness. One house in particular stood out, a dilapidated structure at the end of the block, its windows boarded up and its front yard overrun with weeds. Even from here it looked abandoned, haunted almost. Mark recognized it immediately. It was the old Anderson residence, the site of a devastating fire years ago, a tragedy that had claimed the lives of an entire family, except for their young daughter, who'd been found wandering outside clutching her teddy bear. The pieces began falling into place, though they didn't make sense. Could this be the same girl? No, that was impossible. That child would be older now, grown up. Wouldn't she? Yet there was no denying the resemblance between Lily's teddy bear and the one from the case files he'd read when he was just starting out as a rookie officer. The details were too specific. The missing eye, the faded ribbon, the scorch marks near the bear's left ear. Mark shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts. This wasn't the time to dwell on coincidences. Whatever was going on, Lily needed help, and her parents, if they were still alive, might need saving. He grabbed his flashlight and radio from the car, ensuring Lily was secure before stepping back onto the sidewalk. "Stay here, okay?" he told her firmly but kindly. "I'll be right back." Lily didn't respond, her wide eyes fixed on the house in the distance. There was something unsettling about the way she stared, as if she could see things Mark couldn't. As he turned to follow her gaze, a chill ran down his spine. The night air suddenly felt colder, heavier, as though the shadows themselves were watching him. Whatever awaited him at the end of the street, Mark knew one thing for certain. Nothing about this case was going to be ordinary. As Mark stood on the sidewalk, his flashlight in one hand and his radio in the other, memories began flooding back. Memories he'd tried to bury long ago. The Anderson fire. That was what everyone in Willow Creek had called it. It happened, years ago, when Mark was just starting out as a rookie officer. He remembered the chaos of that night vividly, the flames roaring like a living beast, the thick smoke choking the air, and the desperate cries for help echoing through the neighborhood. When the firefighters finally brought the blaze under control, it was too late. The Anderson family, parents Sarah and David along with their 8-year-old son Tommy, had perished inside. Only one person survived. Their youngest child, a little girl named Emily. She had been found outside the house, clutching her favorite teddy bear, dazed and covered in soot. Mark had been the first officer on the scene, the one who wrapped her in a blanket and promised her everything would be okay. But nothing about that night had felt okay. Not then, and not now. The case had haunted him for years. There were rumors of faulty wiring, whispers of negligence, but no conclusive answers ever came. The house was deemed unsafe and left to rot, a grim reminder of the tragedy that unfolded within its walls. As time passed, people stopped talking about it. Life moved on. Or so Mark thought. Now staring at Lily's teddy bear, the same scorch marks, the same faded ribbon, it was impossible to ignore the eerie parallels. Was this some kind of cruel coincidence? A lost toy that somehow ended up in the hands of another child? Or was there something more going on here, something beyond logic or reason? Mark shook his head, trying to focus. Whatever was happening, Lily needed him. And if her parents or anyone else were still trapped inside that house, every second counted. He glanced back at the patrol car, where Lily sat silently, her wide eyes fixed on the boarded-up house. There was something unsettling about the Way she stared, as though she could see things invisible to everyone else. Her tiny frame seemed fragile, yet there was an odd stillness about her, a calmness that didn't match the terror in her voice earlier. "All right," Mark muttered to himself, gripping his flashlight tighter. "Let's do this." He approached the house cautiously, each step crunching against the gravel driveway. The closer he got, the stronger the sense of unease grew. The structure loomed before him, its windows dark and lifeless, its sagging roof casting jagged shadows across the overgrown yard. Weeds clawed at his boots as he made his way to the front door, which hung slightly ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. Mark's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing remnants of a once happy home now reduced to ruin. Charred furniture lay scattered across the floor, its fabric eaten away by time and fire. Wallpaper peeled off the walls in long strips, curling inward like dead leaves. Every step he took echoed loudly, the wooden floorboards groaning beneath his weight. But despite the desolation, there was something strange about the place. It felt alive. Not in the way a home should feel warm and welcoming, but in a way that sent shivers down his spine. The shadows seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them, and faint noises whispered through the halls, soft creaks, distant murmurs, the sound of footsteps above him. Mark paused, his breath catching in his throat. Someone, or something, was here. He reached for his radio, ready to call for backup, but hesitated. What would he say? That a ghostly little girl led him to an abandoned house where unseen voices whispered in the dark? No one would believe him. They'd think he was losing it, imagining things after too many late-night shifts. Instead, he pressed forward, driven by instinct and the memory of the promise he'd made all those years ago, to Emily, to her family, to himself. If there was even a chance someone needed help, he couldn't turn away. Not now. Not ever. As he climbed the stairs, the sounds grew louder, more distinct. Faint cries echoed through the hallway, followed by the unmistakable sound of pleading voices. Mark froze, his flashlight trembling in his grip. This wasn't right. Houses like this didn't have voices. They didn't hold secrets, or did they? Whatever awaited him at the top of the staircase, Mark knew one thing for certain. He was about to uncover truths that would change everything he thought he knew about that fateful night, and maybe about himself too. Mark's footsteps echoed ominously as he climbed the creaking staircase, each step feeling heavier than the last. The wooden boards groaned under his weight, protesting his presence in this house that had been left to rot for years. His flashlight trembled slightly in his hand, its beam cutting through the thick darkness like a knife slicing through fog. Shadows danced along the walls, twisting and shifting as though they were alive, watching him with unseen eyes. The air grew colder with every step, sending goosebumps rippling across his skin. It wasn't just the chill of an old abandoned building. It felt unnatural, as if the very atmosphere was trying to push him back. But Mark pressed on, driven by a mix of duty and curiosity. He couldn't shake the image of Lily's face, her tear-filled eyes pleading with him to help her parents. Whatever or whoever was waiting for him upstairs, he knew he couldn't turn away now. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched out before him, lined with doors that hung crookedly on their hinges. Some were closed, others slightly ajar, revealing glimpses of rooms frozen in time. A child's bedroom with faded wallpaper covered in tiny stars. A cracked mirror leaning against the wall, reflecting fragments of light from his flashlight. A rocking chair swaying gently, though there was no breeze to move it. And then came the voices. They started faintly at first, a whisper here, a murmur there. But soon they grew louder, more distinct. Mark froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The voices weren't random or chaotic, they sounded desperate, almost pleading. One voice stood out above the rest, soft but urgent. "Help us." His breath hitched. That voice, it sounded familiar, too familiar. Memories of the Anderson family flooded his mind again, their faces staring up at him from the case file, their names etched into his memory. Could it be them? Was he hearing things? Or was something else entirely going on? Summoning his courage, Mark moved toward the sound, his boots scraping softly against the warped floorboards. The hallway seemed endless, stretching on longer than it should have, as if the house itself didn't want him to reach his destination. Finally, he stopped in front of a door at the far end of the hall. Unlike the others, this one was firmly shut, its surface blackened and scarred as though it had borne the brunt of the fire all those years ago. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. Something deep inside told him not to open it, that whatever lay beyond might change everything he thought he understood about the world. But another part of him, the part that had sworn an oath to protect and serve, refused to let fear dictate his actions. With a deep breath, he turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room was pitch black, swallowing the light from his flashlight hole. For a moment, Mark couldn't see anything. Then, slowly, shapes began to emerge from the darkness. A charred crib sat in the corner, its bars bent and broken. A pile of ash rested where a bed must have once been. And in the center of the room, two figures stood motionless, their forms translucent and glowing faintly in the dim light. Mark's blood ran cold. The figures were unmistakable, a man and a woman, their faces filled with anguish. They reached out to him, their mouths moving silently, their eyes locked onto the teddy bear still clutched in his hand. Recognition hit him like a freight train. These were Sarah and David Anderson, the parents who had perished in the fire. Their expressions weren't angry or vengeful. They were filled with sorrow, longing, and something else. Hope. Before Mark could react, a small figure stepped out from behind the couple. It was Lily, or rather Emily, the little girl who had survived the fire all those years ago. She looked exactly as she had that night, clutching her teddy bear tightly to her chest, her wide eyes filled with both fear and relief. "You came back," she whispered, her voice breaking the silence. "We've been waiting." Mark's knees nearly buckled beneath him. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. And yet here they were, the family he'd failed to save, standing before him asking for help one last time. Mark's mind raced as he stood frozen in the doorway, his flashlight trembling in his grip. The room was deathly quiet now, save for the faint hum of energy that seemed to pulse through the air. He stared at the spectral figures before him, the parents, their faces etched with sorrow, and little Emily, her wide eyes locked onto his. Her teddy bear, the same one she had clutched all those years ago, looked impossibly real despite the ghostly glow surrounding her. "You came back," Emily repeated softly, her voice carrying a weight far beyond her years. It wasn't an accusation, but a statement, a plea. Mark swallowed hard, trying to steady his breathing. This couldn't be happening. Ghosts weren't real. Spirits didn't linger in burned-out houses, waiting for someone to set them free. And yet, here they were. "What do you want from me?" Mark finally managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. His throat felt dry, his chest tight with emotion. He wanted to run, to turn and bolt down the stairs and never look back. But something rooted him to the spot, a deep-seated sense of responsibility, guilt even. These were the people he hadn't been able to save. Their deaths had haunted him for years, buried beneath layers of denial and unanswered questions. Now, they were standing right in front of him asking for help. The father, David, spoke first, though no sound left his lips. Instead, his words echoed directly in Mark's mind, clear and resolute. "We're trapped." Sarah, the mother, stepped forward, her translucent hand reaching toward him. Her expression softened, almost apologetic. "We can't move on," she continued, her voice gentle yet filled with anguish. "Not until the truth is known." "The truth?" Mark echoed, confusion mixing with dread. "What truth?" Emily tugged at her mother's sleeve, her small face scrunched up with frustration. "They'd think it was an accident," she said aloud this time, her voice tinged with anger and sadness. "But it wasn't. Someone did this to us. Someone hurt our family." Mark's stomach dropped. All these years, the fire had been ruled a tragic accident caused by faulty wiring. That's what the report said. what everyone believed, including him. But now, staring at the Andersons, he realized how wrong they might have been. Someone had deliberately set that fire, taking innocent lives and leaving behind only pain and unanswered questions. David nodded slowly, his gaze piercing. Find out who did this. Make sure they know we haven't been forgotten. Mark felt a lump rise in his throat. How could he possibly uncover the truth after so many years? The case was cold, the evidence long gone. But looking into the desperate eyes of this broken family, he knew he didn't have a choice. They deserved justice, not just for themselves but for Emily, whose life had been shattered before it even began. I'll do it, Mark said firmly, surprising himself with the conviction in his own voice. I'll find out what really happened. I promise. At his words, the tension in the room seemed to ease ever so slightly. Sarah smiled faintly, her hand lowering to rest on Emily's shoulder. David gave a single, solemn nod, his expression softening with gratitude. Even Emily's posture relaxed, her grip on the teddy bear loosening just a fraction. As Mark watched, the figures began to fade, their forms dissolving into shimmering wisps of light. The oppressive heaviness in the air lifted, replaced by a strange warmth that spread through the room. For the first time since stepping foot inside the house, Mark felt a glimmer of hope, not just for the Andersons but for himself. Before they disappeared completely, Emily turned back to look at him one last time. Her lips curved into a small, grateful smile. Thank you, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Then, with a final flash of light, she was gone. Mark stood there for a moment, his flashlight beam cutting through empty space where the family had been. His legs felt weak, his mind reeling from everything he'd just witnessed. But amidst the shock and disbelief, one thing was certain. He had a mission now. No matter how long it took or how hard it would be, he was going to uncover the truth. For the Andersons, for Emily, and for himself. Mark stumbled back down the stairs, his mind racing faster than his feet. The house no longer felt menacing. Instead, it seemed eerily quiet, as if the weight of years of unresolved grief had finally lifted. But Mark knew the hardest part was yet to come. He had made a promise, not just to the Andersons, but to himself, and he wasn't about to let them down. As he stepped outside into the cool night air, the contrast between the oppressive darkness of the house and the open sky above hit him like a wave. For the first time in hours, he could breathe. Back at his patrol car, Lily, or Emily, was gone. The blanket he'd given her lay neatly folded on the passenger seat, and the interior light cast a soft glow over the empty space where she had sat. Mark's chest tightened. Had she really been there at all? Or had he imagined the entire thing? No, that couldn't be. The teddy bear rested on the dashboard, its worn fur catching the faint light. It was real. She was real. And so was the truth he now had to uncover. The next morning, Mark arrived at the station early, determined to dig into the old case files. His colleagues gave him curious glances as he hauled out dusty boxes from the archives, their labels faded with age. "What are you doing with that old stuff?" one of them joked, sipping coffee. "You trying to solve a cold case for fun?" "Something like that," Mark muttered, brushing off the comment. He didn't have time to explain, not yet. Not until he had answers. For days, Mark pored over every detail of the Anderson fire. Reports, witness statements, photographs, it all came flooding back, each piece of evidence stirring memories he'd tried to bury. At first glance, everything pointed to an accident. Faulty wiring, overloaded circuits, a blaze that spread too quickly for anyone to escape. But the more he read, the more inconsistencies began to surface. A neighbor's statement mentioned seeing a strange car parked near the house late that night. Another recalled hearing an argument coming from the Anderson home earlier in the evening. None of these details had been followed up on at the time. They were dismissed as irrelevant or circumstantial. Then there was the insurance claim. Mark frowned as he flipped through the paperwork. The Andersons had taken out a hefty policy just months before the fire. While not uncommon, it raised questions when paired with other oddities. Why hadn't anyone looked deeper into this? Was it laziness, oversight, or something worse? Determined to find answers, Mark tracked down retired Detective Harris, the lead investigator on the original case. Harris was skeptical at first, brushing off Mark's questions as nostalgia-driven curiosity. But when Mark pressed him about the missing leads and overlooked evidence, Harris hesitated. "Look," the older man said finally, leaning back in his chair. "Back then we didn't have the resources we do now. People wanted closure, not complications. Sometimes you make calls based on what's best for everyone." "But what if those calls were wrong?" Mark shot back, his voice rising despite himself. "What if someone got away with murder?" Harris sighed, rubbing his temples. "If you're serious about this, kid, start with the contractor who inspected the house before the fire. His name's Ray Monroe. He's still around, I think. Just tread carefully. Some secrets don't stay buried without a reason." Mark thanked him and left, his mind buzzing with possibilities. That evening, he tracked down Ray Monroe, a grizzled man in his 60s who lived in a trailer on the outskirts of town. Monroe was reluctant to talk at first, but after some prodding, he admitted to cutting corners during the inspection. "I told them the wiring needed fixing, but they said they couldn't afford it," he confessed, his voice heavy with regret. "I should have pushed harder. Maybe none of this would have happened." As Mark pieced the puzzle together, a chilling picture emerged. The fire hadn't been an accident, it had been deliberate. Someone had tampered with the wiring, ensuring the flames would spread uncontrollably. Whether it was for money, revenge, or something else entirely, Mark didn't know yet. But one thing was clear. The Andersons deserved justice, and he was going to make sure they got it. By the time he returned home late that night, exhaustion weighed heavily on his shoulders. Yet, as he placed the teddy bear gently on his desk, he felt a flicker of hope. Somewhere, somehow, the Andersons were watching and waiting. Mark spent the next several weeks consumed by the case, his days blending into nights as he chased down every lead, no matter how small. The more he uncovered, the clearer it became that the fire at the Anderson home wasn't just a tragedy. It was a crime. Someone had gone to great lengths to cover their tracks, but Mark was determined to expose the truth. Each clue brought him closer to answers, and with each step forward, he felt the weight of responsibility growing heavier on his shoulders. One name kept surfacing in his investigation: Victor Langston. A shady contractor with a history of cutting corners and dodging accountability, Langston had been hired by the Andersons shortly before the fire. At first glance, he seemed like an easy scapegoat, someone who might have botched the wiring and caused the blaze accidentally. But as Mark dug deeper, he discovered something far more sinister. Financial records revealed that Langston had been paid a large sum of money just days before the fire, wired from an anonymous account. It wasn't payment for work. It was hush money. Confronting Langston wasn't easy. The man was evasive, his answers slick and rehearsed, as though he'd spent years preparing for this moment. When Mark showed up at his door unannounced, Langston's face went pale, but he quickly masked his fear with bravado. "I already told you guys everything I know," he snapped, crossing his arms defensively. "You're wasting your time." But Mark wasn't deterred. He laid out the evidence piece by piece, watching Langston's facade crack under the pressure. Finally, the man broke, slumping into a chair and burying his face in his hands. "It wasn't supposed to go down like that," he muttered, his voice trembling. "They said no one would get hurt, just scare them into selling the house, that's all." "Who's they?" Mark pressed, leaning in. His heart pounded in his chest. This was it, the breakthrough he'd been waiting for. Langston hesitated, glancing nervously over his shoulder as if afraid someone might be listening. Then in a low voice he whispered a name: Richard Hargrove. A wealthy real estate developer with a reputation for ruthless tactics, Hargrove had been trying to buy up properties in Willow Creek for years. The Andersons' refusal to sell their home had apparently been the final straw. Desperate to get rid of them, Hargrove had orchestrated the fire, bribing Langston to tamper with the wiring and ensure the house burned beyond repair. The revelation hit Mark like a punch to the gut. Hargrove was a powerful man with connections everywhere. Taking him down wouldn't be easy, but it was necessary. With Langston's confession recorded and signed, Mark took the evidence to his superiors, bracing himself for resistance. To his surprise, they agreed to reopen the case. The arrest warrant for Hargrove came through within days. When the news broke, the town of Willow Creek was shaken to its core. People whispered about justice finally being served, while others expressed disbelief that someone so prominent could commit such an act. For Mark, though, the victory felt bittersweet. He had done what he set out to do, but the cost of the truth weighed heavily on him. Lives had been destroyed, families torn apart, all because of greed and corruption. That night, as Mark sat alone, in his office he noticed something peculiar on his desk. A single golden thread lay there, glinting softly in the lamplight. He picked it up, turning it over in his fingers. It matched the ribbon tied around Emily's teddy bear perfectly. A small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. Somewhere, somehow, the Andersons knew. They had found peace, and maybe, just maybe, so had he. For the first time in years, Mark slept soundly that night. The echoes of the past finally quieted. Weeks turned into months, and the case of the Anderson family fire became a turning point not just for Willow Creek, but for Mark himself. The arrest of Richard Hargrove sent shockwaves through the community. People who had once dismissed the fire as an unfortunate accident now saw it for what it truly was, a calculated act of greed that had cost innocent lives. Hargrove's trial dominated local headlines, his defense team scrambling to discredit the evidence against him. But Mark's meticulous investigation left no room for doubt. Langston's confession, combined with financial records and expert testimonies, painted an undeniable picture of guilt. When the jury returned their verdict, guilty on all counts, the courtroom erupted in murmurs of relief and vindication. For Mark, the resolution brought a sense of closure he hadn't realized he'd been searching for. He visited the old Anderson house one last time after the trial, standing outside its crumbling walls as the sun dipped below the horizon. The air felt lighter now, the oppressive weight that had once clung to the property gone. He carried Emily's teddy bear with him, its faded fur and frayed ribbons serving as a tangible reminder of the little girl who had led him to the truth. Placing it gently on the front porch, he whispered, "You can rest now. All of you." As he walked back to his car, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, not in a menacing way, but in a comforting one. A soft breeze rustled the overgrown grass, carrying with it the faint sound of laughter. For a moment, Mark thought he saw shadows moving in the upstairs window, small figures waving goodbye. He smiled softly, climbed into his cruiser, and drove, away without looking back. The town began to heal in the aftermath. The Anderson story was shared widely, ensuring their memory wouldn't fade into obscurity. A memorial plaque was placed near the site of their home, honoring their lives and reminding everyone of the importance of justice and accountability. Mark attended the dedication ceremony, standing quietly at the edge of the crowd as neighbors laid flowers and lit candles. It was a somber yet hopeful gathering, proof that even in tragedy there could be redemption. Professionally, the case reignited Mark's passion for his work. He threw himself into his role with renewed purpose, determined to make a difference in ways both big and small. His colleagues noticed the change in him. Gone was the weary officer weighed down by unresolved cases. In his place was someone driven by empathy and resilience. Young officers looked up to him, seeking advice on how to handle difficult cases or navigate moral dilemmas. Mark became a mentor, sharing not just his experience but also the lessons he'd learned from the Andersons. That every life mattered, every voice deserved to be heard, and no truth was too buried to uncover. On quiet nights when the streets were calm and the world seemed to hold its breath, Mark would find himself thinking about Emily. Her courage had changed everything, not just for her family, but for him too. She had reminded him why he wore the badge, why he chose this path in the first place. In a way, she had saved him as much as he had tried to save her. One evening, as Mark sat at his desk finishing paperwork, he noticed something unusual, a golden thread lying neatly across his keyboard. It matched the ribbon from Emily's teddy, bare perfectly. This time, instead of surprise, he felt warmth spread through his chest. Picking it up, he tied it carefully around the pen holder on his desk, a silent tribute to the little girl who had taught him so much. Mark didn't know if the supernatural elements of that night had been real, or if they were products of his imagination fueled by grief and determination. What he did know was that the Anderson story had left an indelible mark on him, and on Willow Creek. Justice had been served, memories honored, and peace restored, not just for the family who had lost everything, but for the man who had vowed to fight for them. And as Mark switched off the desk lamp and headed home under the starlit sky, he knew one thing for certain: some bonds transcend time, space, and even death. And sometimes, the smallest voices carry the loudest truths.